To ask Kathy Albisa, if I could, to talk a little bit about what it is that we mean, or maybe I should say you mean, by the human rights framework, given that we don't always find a ready common definition. What do we mean?
And certainly there isn't a common definition. It's a little bit of one of those things where it is what you make of it. And what's interesting about what's been happening for the last many years in the U.S. is what people have been trying to make of it, right? I mean, there's a couple of things the framework has been that hasn't been all good, just to kind of acknowledge that up front. I mean, there's been a lot of critiques in the international arena about, you know, it's been a tool of foreign policy, it's been a tool for imperialism. Those things have been true. There's been a lot of critiques about, well, it's a narrow legal framework, it doesn't take into account, you know, movements or social justice. At times, that has been true. But what's interesting about what's been happening for the last maybe 15 years, very slowly and now more in a more accelerated pace, is what people have been trying to make of it. It's the number of people that have entered into it as a kind of contested territory and turned it into something else that is much more and much better than those things. So who are and what are they? Well, who are these people is too long a list, but what are folks, and especially now I'll limit myself to the U.S. kind of human rights movement, trying to make of it? There's a range of ways people engage in it. For people that at the sort of core are very committed to it, it's really a vision. It's a vision, and it's a vision where rights do not exist as something that define the space or the protective space or the barriers between people and government, right? Where rights are not about what government can't do, but it's a vision of rights within relationships, right? So rather than thinking about rights as just a kind of defensive tool, you think about rights as a way of creating a vision on how to build society, how to structure our relationships. And why is it that? Because there's two very different things about the human rights framework than our more traditional constitutional framework. One is this notion of positive rights, and what that means is it's an obligation to do something, not just not only not to do something. It's about what government needs to, the space it needs to occupy rather than just avoid. The second is the inclusion of economic, social, and cultural rights. These, almost by definition, are rights in relationship, not rights, you know, to avoid relationships. So it's inherently a more social justice approach to rights than maybe what we've been used to the last couple of decades, and therefore can become a bridge to perhaps heal some of these worldview or ideological divides between this very interesting conversation this morning about, are you a progressive, are you a liberal, are you a social justice? You know, I mean, it's a potential bridge that brings a lot of that together, depending on how you engage with it, that can bring social justice and legal and other sectors together as well. Again, if what you make of it is a vision for movement building. It can also be a guide to positive solutions because it is proactive, because it is not just about no, and you can't, and you did this. Rather, no, you can't do this, but here are all the things that human rights actually require. And it becomes this kind of series of guideposts to move our society in a more just direction. There was an interesting comment on the first panel about how we've been reluctant to invest in these, quote, philosophical or abstract conversations. I think I know what he was referring to, except I don't see them as so philosophical or abstract. But there has been a hesitancy to invest time, energy, resources into the vision the glue that brings us all together. So that when we come to the table and say, oh, we should all work together because we're on the same page, we haven't spent the time making sure we're all on the same page, or coming to agreement as to, you know, what's going to be written down on those pages. And human rights is one contested space, again, to fill those pages up. There are others, but it is one viable approach. What I realized when we were losing under the second Bush administration in courts, and then losing again under the Clinton administration, because nothing really got that much better, was that the things that we're holding, the things we were able to hold on to in some ways, at least the core of it, were the things that the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement really had embedded in our society as core values, as fundamental rights that were beyond their legal home, right? I mean, there was nothing constitutional about Title VII, but we weren't going to repeal that one, right? That was a line in the sand that could not be crossed. And what I realized we had stopped doing when I saw welfare reform go, you could have just blown it over with a feather, the entire entitlement program, for all the resistance we were able to put up, was that there were certain lines we hadn't drawn. And that we were not going to be able to draw those lines with the tools that we had. And that's when I really started to look for some alternatives. And when I started working on it, it seemed like it was it was going to be a very long-term effort, because we were under, Bush 1, Bush 2. I've had a lot of luck generationally in terms of when I've been able to do my work. But I thought we have to build some sort of foundation for when the moment arrives, being able to draw these lines in the sand that will hold up generationally. And now we have a moment where there's still much work to do, because there's been, both great things and tremendous disappointments, but we have a moment of opportunity. And if we don't use it, not just to push through some pragmatic policies, but to build movement in a way that changes core values, then it's just going to cycle back again, right? 10, 20, 30 years from now, it's just going to cycle back. So the fact that we have some movement around healthcare reform, albeit market-based, is an opportunity to draw a line in the sand around universal healthcare. Still not healthcare as a public good, but at least universal access. But we're not going to do that with the current conversation that it's about an economic problem. It has to be, as Gian said, a moral problem. A problem that endures, that the value endures irrespective of the economic situation changing. So I just wanted to sort of, add that piece, because a lot for me is about how do we create sustainable wins for communities, and not continue fighting the same battles over and over again through just power, because we haven't tapped into that sort of values shift.